Understanding how networks of political information operate and relate to one another can help us to be more critical consumers of news and hopefully better decision makers in a representative democracy. We want to thank the Departments of Math and Computer Science, Psychology, Russian Studies in Modern Languages and Literatures, Political Science, and the program in Political Economy for their support. In particular, we are grateful for the efforts of Jackie Baker in Political Science for helping with the logistics and the meticulous details needed to make everything happen tonight. We also want to thank the Offices of Communications and Information Services for their assistance. I first met our guest speaker tonight after I moved to Memphis because we both shared an interest in media analysis and the belief that understanding media matters for understanding American democracy. As the media landscape shifts under our feet, we need to understand correctly what is happening and to consider the consequences for our political system, our democratic institutions, our decision-making processes, and for our larger civil society. Some of us in the audience remember a time not long ago when just 3 network news channels directed their restless searchlights collectively toward the same stories and created an identical mainstream news media agenda for the public. In this prior media environment of limited consumer choice, we also saw a system characterized by high public trust as professionals like Walter Cronkite provided a clear, shared picture of reality upon which the citizen can act, Walter Lippmann's definition of news. Yet over the last several decades, policies of deregulation coupled with technological advances like digital spectrum created more competitive markets with greater choice of channels and programming content for consumers. Cable television brought dueling pundits, interpreting news for viewers, and an environment where news had to compete with entertainment. The growth of the internet continued to transform the media ecosystem into a fragmented environment where armchair pundits channeled media professionals and upended the gatekeeping hierarchy. Blogs, Facebook, and Twitter elevated a wider range of perspectives, but this democratization of the information environment also left members of the public somewhat rudderless in evaluating sources and constructing their own versions of news as trust in media as an institution declined. News consumers' search for the truth is complicated by the prospect of fake news, defined as false and untrue stories created to sow conflict, and Russian troll factories manipulating social media users and pushing discord and discontent on Facebook and Twitter, reinforcing existing challenges of the current fragmented, high-choice, and social interactive media environment. We all fall victim to our human design flaws, using motivated reasoning to selectively sort information, reinforcing our preconceptions to selectively, in an inner quest to avoid cognitive dissonance. This leads to polarization of the voting public and drives us apart instead of bringing people together. Hal's research with his colleagues at the Berkman Center reveals greater clarity about the contours and the characteristics of these sides in the larger media ecosystem that previously have not been revealed in such detail, with important consequences for the nature of ideas and political discourse in society in 2018. They harness the power of big data that was not previously available to provide these insights. We live in a dynamic time in history with technological change happening faster than we can keep up with. These analytical approaches provide an opportunity to gain a new perspective on our political and social reality. Now I want to turn the microphone over to Betsy Sanders, Associate Professor and Head of Computer Science, to talk more about data analytics and to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Amy. As many of you know, computer science enrollments have been skyrocketing at Rhodes. And one explanation is that many students like you are seeing power in the ability to thoughtfully acquire, carefully analyze, and interpret one of the world's most abundant resources, data. Many Rhodes students are employing computational techniques to embark on transformative journeys in disciplines other than computer science. And tonight, Hal is going to take you on a transformative journey made possible by his exciting interdisciplinary background. So I'm going to spend a few minutes and talk about Hal. I'm going to talk about some of the exciting, his background, and I'm going to talk about some of the exciting initiatives that we have going on at Rhodes that complements his research. I first met Hal back when he reached out to me for advice on how to best teach computer science to high school students. And back in 2015, Hal was shocked to find that his daughter's school did not offer a computer science class. And he was determined to bridge the gap. But high school computer science teachers are nearly impossible to find. So he set off researching how best to accomplish this goal himself. And I'm pleased to report that he has successfully taught computer science since the spring of 2016 to classes of all girls. And this is important because girls only make up about 18% of graduating CS college majors across the United States. And much research has shown that being exposed to computer science before college is a game changer on the chances that people from underrepresented groups stick with computer science. I've also had the chance to be mesmerized by Hal's daughter, Angela, when I taught her Camp Codet. Camp Codet, for those of you that don't know, is a week-long summer coding camp that we started here at Rhodes aimed to getting more underrepresented groups interested in computer science. And although I met Hal through our computer science discussions, I'm in awe of the research that he has produced. And in particular, his latest book on network propaganda is the highlight of tonight's talk. I'll also point out that it was published by Oxford University Press, and that just gives it a certain mark of prestige and importance for us. So I want to talk a little bit about Hal's background, which makes this interesting interdisciplinary talk possible. Hal has a BA in cultural anthropology from Princeton, with a minor in applications of computer science. And as he points out, he split his time between seminar rooms of mostly women discussing anthropology, and then computer labs of mostly men hacking on CS assignments. He has a master's degree in science, technology, and society from Virginia Tech. And he started at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard in 2001 as the director of technology and transitioned to a research role in 2007. He was initially working on issues of internet control, like filtering and cyber attacks. The Berkman Klein Center at Harvard is an interesting interdisciplinary center. It is one of only a small handful of campus-wide research center at Harvard. And since 2010, his research as a research fellow at the center has focused almost solely on Media Cloud. And Media Cloud is a partnership between the Berkman Klein Center and the Center for Civic Media at MIT Media Lab. Hal calls the research that he does in the book, and within Media Cloud generally, a media ecosystems approach. He says the easiest bucket to fit his work into is computational social science, but he spends a lot more time and effort digging into context and the qualitative data than most computational social science work. And he's going to talk a little bit more about that in his work. His goal, Hal's goal in all of this, is to build and maintain all the back-end systems that collect, process, and analyze data, but more importantly, to understand how to apply that data and its finding to big social science questions, and also to adapt the back-end data and processes to be able to answer the right questions in ways that are useful and repeatable. So if you're finding this background interesting, you're going to love this talk. And you'll be glad to hear that Rhodes College sees the future for interdisciplinary avenues of studies such as these. At Rhodes, we are currently working on a data analytics major, which will have connections to computer science and stats and psychology and economics, sociology, business, and of course, political science. You'll be able to get more how-like superpowers right here at Rhodes. Now, just before I turn over the stage to our guest speaker, I request that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. We'll be distributing microphones. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Hal Roberts.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. I want to first thank Rhodes for inviting me and all the sponsoring departments, and especially to Dr. Saunders and Dr. Jasperson for all their work to put this talk together. So I'm going to talk tonight about my book, Network Propaganda, which I've written, as they mentioned, at the Berkman Klein Center with my co-authors, Yochai Binkler and Robert Ferris. The guiding question of this book is, how did we get here? What the heck just happened? We all have a sense that something's not working right with our democracy, and for sure with our media, which is our sort of our public sphere where we use to determine the truth that guides our how we navigate our democracy as a country. And maybe the greatest example of that is this Pizzagate scandal, right? So I'm sure all of you have heard that or have some sense of what it is. And this is a claim that there's some evidence that Hillary Clinton and some number of her members of her campaign were participating in a child sex ring in a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Pizzagate is interesting because it didn't get a lot of coverage in mainstream news, and it got a lot more coverage as a lot more meta coverage, which is to say coverage saying, look at this weird thing that's happening in our media, than actual stories about it. But nonetheless, if you look at this chart on the top left, what you see on the left is sort of partisan divides on belief in whether Russia had any role in hacking democratic servers. And you see this really stark divide where 80% of Republicans think that the Russians had no role, and 87% of Democrats think that they had a role, despite, you know, all of the apparatus of the government saying they did have a role. There's still this really stark divide where we can't decide together whether there's a truth there. But even more striking on the right is a question of whether there's some truth to the fact that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of a pizzeria. And we see here that 53% of Trump voters say yeah. So what does that mean? I don't actually know what that means. Surveys are weird. Surveys during elections are really weird. I think that if you made those 53% of Republicans bet $1 million about whether that was happening, you'd get a lot lower number. We know that people answer surveys as much to vote for their tribe and for their ideology as for the actual answer. But nonetheless, there are real results of that, right? So people are basing their voting decisions on that. It has real impact. So that has even more questions for what does this mean? What is truth? How do we decide what truth is? And then we end up after the election in the state where 51 Republicans think that the press is the enemy of the people because the press is saying there's nothing to Pizzagate, right? So how did we get here? So let's first look at another more recent example. So this is Ben Sasse, a Republican senator, who's talking about this idea of deep fakes. So the idea of deep fakes is we have the technology now where just by watching the video of me talking, you could go away with a large computer, with not a too big computer actually, for a couple of days and come back and make me say something completely different than what I'm actually saying. And my mouth would look right and it would be really hard for you to tell the difference. So there's been a lot of worry and consternation that how are we going to know what's true if we have these deep fakes? So this is another example that I just want to bring up because I'm going to return to it at the end of the talk. So what we try to do in our book is identify the root cause. What are the most important factors? And the first thing that we did is try to just set up sort of a dramatist persona of what are the different possible factors? What are the things that people have talked about and we think might be the cause of these issues? Ignore the sort of chart and just look at this now for sort of the list of possible actors. We have Facebook, both in the sense of filter bubbles, which means if we're on Facebook, we read the stuff our friends who are like us read, so we all end up just reading a little subset of the stuff that we like. Micro-targeting, which is the idea of very sophisticated ads that make us believe things that we wouldn't otherwise believe. The idea of fake news, which is just the sort of Estonian teenager setting up a fake news site in his bedroom and just pumping out, making stuff up. And then another major one is Russia. So we just, we've obviously been involved in a national debate and investigation for 2 years, trying to figure out what role Russia had in all this. So this is kind of the dramatis persona that we use to approach to understand what are the possible causes of this. Along the bottom, you see more traditional causes. One is just Trump. Was it just that Trump is just sui generis? He's so different than anybody else that he caused some of this to happen. The others that the mainstream media as the enemy of the people caused this. And then the other is right-wing media. And we'll discuss as we go why we have right-wing media specifically instead of just partisan media. So how do we answer those questions? We answer those questions most importantly with data. So this isn't a book where we just sort of think about it and sort of conjecture what might happen. This is a book that's the result of 2.5 years of us collecting over 4 million stories from a platform. We have an open platform called Media Cloud that actually has about 1 billion stories collected over the past 10 years that we use to answer questions like this. So for this particular project, we had about 4 million stories about the election or post-election about national politics for this first year of the Trump presidency. Within that data, we get the content of the web pages that we collect. So this is just a rack of big computers at MIT that are just collecting all this data. We get the text that we can look at. We can look at the hyperlinks, so understand how sites hyperlink to one another. We can look at Twitter and Facebook share data, so we know how for each of those 4 million stories, we know how many times they were shared on Twitter, how many times they were shared on Facebook. We get some data from a site called the TV Archive, which is it's archive.org. You may have heard of the Wayback Machine. You may have used it. They collect transcripts of TV programs, so we use that to search to understand how TV interacts. And then we use what we call mixed methods. That means we do a lot with data. I'm a computer scientist. I deal with data all day, but I'm also deeply skeptical of it because I know dealing with data, I know it's really easy to pipe a lot of data into some sort of visualization or into some sort of fancy algorithm, and for it to spit out something that looks very pretty and very convincing, but might or might not be an artifact of the data you collected, how you collected it, how the algorithm ran, any number of things. So we always try to bounce different sources of data off of one another, different ways of analyzing the data, but most importantly, we use the data as not only as a source of results themselves, but more generally as a roadmap for us to go and read the content deeply ourselves to try to understand within the larger political, social context what those data-based results mean. And the rest of this talk, you'll see an example of that. I'm going to start off with some very data-based results, and then we're going to sort of spend the rest of the time talking about specific case studies of how those worked out for specific stories. So this is probably the single most interesting finding and most important finding we have. And this is a chart that shows what we call asymmetric polarization. So there's been a lot of work on polarization and partisanship in US media. And most of the results to date have pretty consistently shown that when you look at any discussion, you see that conservatives like to talk to one another and liberals like to talk to one another. So that would be an example of sort of symmetric polarization. So, and this is the way the problem is often talked about in the media and other places is, boy, we have this problem where conservatives just talk to conservatives, liberals talk to liberals, and nobody can talk to one another. What we think that this shows is that that's not actually a problem. So let's talk about how what these charts are and what they mean. This top chart is a chart of which sites got the most hyperlinks within those 4 million. This is actually from the election, so within it, for about 2.5 million stories. Which of the stories and sites, which means like Fox News or New York Times or Washington Post or Huffington Post, which got the most links to them? That's one way of measuring influence. This chart is colored by a metric of audience attention partisanship. Stick with me, we'll get there. So what this means is the blue things are sites that were that were shared almost exclusively by liberal tweeters. The red things are sites that were tweeted almost exclusively by conservative tweeters. What we actually mean by that is we just look at, by liberal tweeters, we just define anybody who ever retweeted Hillary Clinton's account. And for conservative tweeters, we just define as anybody who ever retweeted one of Donald Trump's tweets. So this is all data. This is not me, staring at these sites. There's a lot of, you can go to a lot of sites on the internet and they'll happily tell you, well, this site is very conservative, this is very liberal. This is just all data-based. It doesn't say anything about the content, but it just says something about the attention that's paid to those sites and the partisanship of the attention. And what you see here is what we call a skewed distribution, which is a fancy term for, on the right, the large majority of the links are going to sites that are almost only shared by conservative tweeters. On the left, we see a more normal distribution, where yes, there is a fair amount of attention paid to to sites that are tweeted more by liberal users. You see as it gets to the far left, you get less attention paid. The light blue there is what we call the center left, but what it actually is, almost all of that attention is mainstream media. That's New York Times, Washington Post. Those are the big sort of traditional institutional journalism publications. And what you see is this sort of normal distribution, which means kind of a bump in between the left and that center left. This middle chart is the same thing, but for Twitter shares. So what we see is we go from hyperlinks to Twitter, the skew of that right is even more so. So we see to even greater degree, a majority now of the shares of conservative sites are shares of sites that are almost only shared by conservative users. And then the bottom chart is for Facebook. And by the time we get to Facebook, almost the only sites that are shared on the right are sites that are sites to which only conservative users pay attention. This again we call asymmetric polarization, and the other way we refer to it is the right versus the rest. And you can see that in an alternative mode here. So again, we're starting off with lots of sort of fancy math and big data, and then we're going to move into stories, so stick with me a little bit. This is a map of the 1,000 most highly linked sites during the period of the election. Each dot is a site, so New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, The Hill. The coloring is the same coloring we used on the other slide. So the red are very conservative sites. They're sites that are almost only tweeted by conservative users. Blue are liberal sites. The light blue is center left. The green is center. So green are sites that are tweeted about the same by conservative and liberal users. And the pink is center right. So you'll notice a couple things about this chart. One is there's almost no center right. It's hard to find it. The other is that there is definitely a red and a blue side of the map. But the blue side, even though it's separate, is very cozied up into the mainstream media. Whereas the right side, the conservative side, is off completely on its own. And what we refer to this is the right versus the rest. So we have on the one side, we have the right media ecosystem, which is linking almost only to itself. And on the left side, we have a liberal side, but a liberal side that's very closely integrated with that mainstream media. I should back up and say the way that we generated this map is by hyperlinking behavior. So nodes that are close to one another are nodes that tend to link to one another. So the fact that Breitbart, Daily Caller, and Fox News are kind of close to one another in a triangle means that those sites tend to link to one another and also to other similar type sites. And the fact that the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Vox are close to another on the other side means that those are sites, again, that tend to link to each other and to other similar sites. The other thing you'll notice here is that those big traditional media sites, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, CNN, they're still the center of gravity of this map. So if you had to ask where's most attention being paid, it's still being paid to the mainstream media. So that map's big. This is just a zoom in of the same map. It's just with only the top 100 sites showing. You can see here, again, looking at the right, we have this sort of diamond of sites that are right at the core of that right network, which are Fox, the Washington Examiner, the Daily Mail, Breitbart, and Daily Caller. One just obvious but important thing to think about is none of those sites existed more than about 20 years ago. Fox is the oldest site that's there. And most of them are much younger. Some of those sites claim to obey sort of traditional norms and processes of journalism. I will argue tonight that they in fact don't. But many of them don't. Breitbart says there is no such thing as objective journalism. We're all just arguing for our own truths. So this is the same idea, but this map is generated by Twitter sharing behavior. So in this map, sources that are close to one another are sources that tend to be shared by the same Twitter users, okay? So I talked before about being skeptical of our own data. This is an example. This map is generated by the same kind of algorithm, but a totally different data set. So this previous map we saw was based on hyperlinking behavior. This map is based on Twitter sharing behavior, and you see that we learned the same lesson. So this is one example of of us using mixed methods to say, well, we got a pretty map. It's really easy to believe a pretty map because it's pretty and it confirms something we think we know about the world or it's interesting. But it's really important to try to look at things from a different angle. This is a different angle and it has a very remarkably similar map. The one thing to note here is that Breitbart becomes an even bigger center of that conservative network in a way that Huffington Post also does on the left. You'll see the Huffington Post is still cozied up sort of next to and connected to those big mainstream media nodes, which are still very influential, whereas on the right, it's just totally segregated by itself. This is the same map, it's just shared by numbers of Facebook shares. So in here we just see even more influence by Huffington Post and Breitbart, even though still the mainstream media is quite popular on social media. And finally, this is a map of Twitter in 2017. So here we're asking the question, was this something that was just happening in the election because elections are crazy? So here we're looking at the first year of the Trump presidency. And what we see is even more dramatically, we see this really dramatic separation between left and right. The kinds of algorithms we run to generate these maps using web data, they have a strong tendency to sort of generate balls of yarn, to generate things that look like circles like this. And to see a little bit of separation is a very strong signal. To see this giant gap here is something we do a lot of these for for topics other than election, and this is extraordinarily rare to see this level of separation. So coming back to this, to our dramatist persona, what is the cause here? What we're arguing is that the cause here is not all of the technological stuff over here. The fact that we have this asymmetric polarization, what we can learn from that is that liberals and conservatives, they use the same Facebook. They use the same Twitter. They use all the same tools. So if there's a fundamentally technologically determined answer to this question, then we'd expect to see roughly the same shape of left versus right media ecosystems. The fact that we see something completely different makes us very skeptical of these sort of Facebook, fake news, Facebook algorithm type answers, right? If it's just technology, everybody's going to use the technology and we're going to be evil, and we're going to be equal. If there's something different happening on the right versus the left, then we'd expect to see different shapes and architectures, and that's exactly what we see. What we're arguing is that, in fact, the main problem is with this structure, with this architecture of asymmetric polarization, which is a main feature of the right-wing media. The challenge is that if we chart these things on how political versus institutional they are, versus technological and commercial, technological and commercial things are easier to at least imagine how to fix, right? If Facebook was the problem, then we can just summon Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress and yell at him, and we could pass a law to make him do something, and you can imagine a solution, right? If the problem is a long-standing problem of our political institutions, it's a lot harder to imagine what to do. And also it involves treating one side differently than the other, which is a hard thing to do as a society. It's a hard thing to do for journalists to say and do because they're supposed to be neutral. It's a hard thing for academics to say and do because we're supposed to be neutral. So everybody, if you remember immediately after the election, there were lots of stories about Russian hackers and fake news and Cambridge Analytica. There's an enormous amount of coverage in actually mainstream media where they were trying to figure out what happened, and those are the sort of the easy things to blame. But what we think is, even though they have an impact for sure, which we'll talk about, the core problem that we need to focus on is the architecture of the right-wing media. So the title of the book is Network Propaganda. And what we mean by network propaganda is what we refer to as a propaganda dynamics in the media ecosystem. We contrast that with what we call reality check dynamics. And what that means is the public, the politicians, and the media are all in relationships with one another where they're sometimes agreeing with and helping each other, but within which there's also a lot of tension and friction. So the media is sometimes telling the public stuff that it likes and wants to know, but it's sometimes telling its readers some stuff that it doesn't want to know because it's the truth. Same thing with politicians. Sometimes the politicians are using the media and getting good messages out of it. Sometimes the media is acting in opposition to specific politicians. So you have both some working together and some friction in those relationships. When we have a propaganda feedback loop, you take that sort of reality check out of all those relationships. What you end up with is the public only hearing good news from its media, and the media only giving good news to its public. You end up with politicians working directly with the media to only give good news for their interests. And you end up with, because the public is only hearing good news about their politicians, you end up with less friction with the politicians. To some degree, what this is a model of is what we call confirmation bias, which Dr. Jasperson talked about. We have an ideal for our democracy that we're all reading media, we're all reading content in the public sphere to understand the truth so that we can get to the best policy that aligns with our values. There's abundant research that says that's not at all the case. And in fact, we read news mostly to confirm what we already know about the world because it makes us feel good. We all do that. Liberals, conservatives, independents, everybody as a group, right? There are some individual exceptions, but as a group, we all tend to read stuff about the world to confirm what we all know. It's how our brains work as humans, right? What is alarming about this is that if you have a media ecosystem that's built to give you no friction, to never give you bad news, then it preys upon the worst examples of that confirmation bias. You're only going to get good news, and that's going to accelerate and amplify whatever beliefs and tribal associations you have. So this is an example of what happens when you have a very tight propaganda feedback loop. These are examples from the primary, where the conservative media is just working really hard at an ideological level to enforce its ideology. So you have what seem like crazy things, right? You have these sort of Nazi pictures of George Bush, and you have Fox News, right, being pilloried by Breitbart for not having extreme immigration views. Wrong way. So the question is, how do we sort of test out this theory? So this is kind of our theory when we look at those two maps. When we look at that right versus the rest, we have a hypothesis that this is bad, right? So how do we test that things on the right are being treated differently than stories on the right, and the way that they treat these dynamics are different on the right versus the left? It turns out we have a natural experiment, sadly. Which is both candidates were accused of pedophilia during the campaign. Trump was actually sued for raping a 13-year-old. It was pretty clearly, it was a suit by like a former producer on the Jerry Springer show. So it pretty clearly was, did not have a lot of truth to it, but it was there, it was an actual lawsuit. On the right, you have this Jeffrey Epstein story. So Jeffrey Epstein was a billionaire who was actually convicted of pedophilia. And the Clintons were associates of him and had flown on his plane before, actually as had Trump. But that got turned into stories that Hillary Clinton was herself on Jeffrey Epstein's island, personally assaulting children. So both of these seem ridiculous, right? And are the kinds of stories that would be taken up by sort of hyper-partisan media. And if you look in the top left, we have a chart of uptake of each of these stories in hyper-partisan media. So these are the media on the side that we're going to expect either right or left are going to say whatever crazy thing is going to support their side. And we see that to be the case. So we see actually even more uptake of the Trump rape story on the left than we see of the pedophilia stuff, Clinton pedophilia stuff on the right. When we go into the core of the network, though, into those big sites that actually matter and are getting a lot of influence, what we see on the left is almost no attention paid to the Trump rape stories and an enormous amount of attention still paid to that Clinton pedophilia story. We think this is a really strong signal of this propaganda feedback loop model working, right? On the left, we have the reality check dynamic where, yes, there are lots of sites on the left that would like for this Trump rape lawsuit to have been true. But those left sites are integrated with the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is not touching it because they're saying it doesn't seem true to them. On the right, you don't have any friction there. So they just take anything that just supports their ideology, and they're going to amplify it as much as they can, and you end up with a lot of uptake of this. So what does this look like? These are examples of this Trump rape story. What you see is Jezebel, which is a very far left site, which is not judging it, it's just a partisan site. That's happy to jump into the story with all of the fervor it can summon. But then if you look at even, arguably quite liberal sites like The Guardian, you have stories basically saying, or even The Daily Beast, which is a quite liberal site, says Trump rape accusers turn on each other. It's giving attention to it that the New York Times wouldn't even, but it's not a positive story about it, right? And in fact, you have, again, remember all those liberal sites depending heavily on those mainstream media. The mainstream media is just not discussing it at all. So it gets no traction. This is the opposite example on the right, where what you have happening is you have these core sites, you have the Daily Caller, the Fox, the Breitbart, they're cozying up as close to the story as they can. Right? So they might not be quite as crazy as the stuff as InfoWars, but they're doing everything that they possibly can within their confines to encourage attention to the story. We actually have more salacious headlines from Fox, but these are, again, remember, Fox News, Breitbart, Daily Caller, those are the three biggest, most influential sites in that right media ecosystem, and they're happy to amplify this story as much as possible. This was a significant story on the right. If you read a lot of conservative media during the campaign, you would be very familiar with Orgy Island and Jeffrey Epstein. So we study the internet at Berkman Klein. So we're inclined to actually believe technological answers to questions. So when we're looking at the election in the first place, our intuition is going to be that Facebook is the problem or it's Russian hackers. But it's important to step back and think about the larger ecosystem and how it works. So this is a Pew study. This is a Pew survey of where voters actually get their news. And what you see is that the single biggest and most influential news source among all sources by a large degree among Republicans and Democrats is Fox News. And if you look at just Republicans, it's fantastically dramatic that almost a majority of Republicans get most of their news from Fox News. And what that generally means is Fox News TV. It's not online. It's just watching Fox News. On the left, we see a lot more diversity. It's still a lot of cable TV, right? So this is one of the geniuses of Trump, is he recognized that as much as we think of ourselves as a 21st century internet-driven country, most people are still getting their news from cable TV. This again, just trying to rely on mixed methods and be skeptical of all sources. This is just another source where we look at trust in different media sources. This survey was not done by us, but the coloring is our partisan categories. And what you see on the left is sort of, even for very liberal respondents, you see quite a diversity of different news sources. Some quite liberal, mostly somewhat liberal, some center. As soon as you get over to the left, on the far or to the right, on the far right, you see Fox News again important, but then you see these sort of Hannity and Limbaugh, the major pundits, and Glenn Beck. So one way to read this is to say, if you're looking at worldviews, on the right, reading Hannity is the same as someone watching PBS on the left. That's the sort of equivalence, and that's what's broken. What's maybe even more disturbing is for the just mostly conservative people, it's just all Fox. That's the only place they're getting news is Fox. So how does this work in practice? What we're going to walk through here, again, moving into looking at actual content and how actual stories were treated, is looking at some of the ways that Fox, as a sort of major center of this right media ecosystem, is running active interference for the Republican Party and Trump specifically, in a way that sources on the mainstream sources, especially on the left, who still try to obey these sort of norms and norms and processes of objective journalism, can't imagine doing. So one example is coverage of the idea of deep state. So the deep state is this idea of that the FBI is the deep state and is trying to commit a coup against Trump, or the CIA is a better example. Before November 2016, the idea of the deep state existed. It existed within other authoritarian countries, right? So this is, again, this is sort of fancy math applied to big data. So we take all of the content in these millions of stories, we look at all of the sentences that have the word deep state in them. We take the other words in those sentences and sort of plot them to see how they're related to one another. And you can see that all of the words related to deep state are about basically Egypt and Turkey, which are two authoritarian states, and how they're, that's basically Egypt's military is trying to take over its democratically elected government kind of thing. There's a guy named Glenn Greenwald who's kind of an iconoclast on the left. He's kind of liberal. He broke the Snowden stories, but he's also very anti-establishment. And he started talking a little bit about the deep state in like October 2016. But then in November 2016, on one day, Fox, we have this spike in talking about the deep state, and it's driven almost entirely by Fox. So Fox just decided on one day that it needed to start talking about the idea of the deep state when it hadn't been talked about before. Why would it do that on that date? Well, it turns out on November 2016 is when Manafort and Flynn were indicted. Literally the day after that indictment happened, the deep state became a major topic of discussion on Fox News. So what we take of this is evidence not just that Fox is maybe shading his coverage a little bit one way or the other. It's actually running active interference, right? So we think about back to that model of that propaganda feedback loop. It's trying to actively give only good news to its politicians and its public. So what does this look like in data? On this right chart, here we've used this TV archive to look at mentions of deep state in Fox versus MSNBC versus CNN and Fox Business. The orange is Fox there. And you can see that Fox is the highest. That means it's clearly driving the discussion of this. So once Fox starts talking about that, other channels start talking about it as well, if nothing else than just to say, hey, now Trump is talking about deep state or whatever. We have multiple examples of this. Another example is the Seth Rich conspiracy. So this is the idea that a Democratic staffer named Seth Rich, who was actually murdered on the streets of DC. This is the conspiracy theory that he was murdered because he was actually responsible for the hacks of the DNC emails. That's a conspiracy theory that has no actual evidence. But started to get it got a little bit of attention you see in July, but then in May of 2017, it got a lot of attention the day after Comey was fired. And this was an example where Fox actually, I won't go into all the details, it made up a sort of circular set of sources who were just referring to one another as sources for the story, and they ended up retracting it all in the end. But it accomplished its purpose, because the day after Comey was fired, everybody was, the right, the separated ecosystem that doesn't associate with the rest of the ecosystem, was talking about Seth Rich instead of Comey firing. We have other examples of sort of traditional elite manipulation of the media ecosystem. This Uranium One example is a good example. This is the idea that Hillary Clinton was bribed to give all of our uranium to Russia, or some substantial portion of it. Lots of independent checkers have looked at this and seen no validity to these claims. Where this claim initially came from, we'll talk about that in a sec, but what you see here is this is another example that on a day of yet another case of bad news in the Mueller investigation, we see a little bit of uptake way back in April of this uranium story. And then in, again, November of 2017, we see an enormous amount of attention paid directly after more bad news from the Mueller investigation. And this happens not only online. These are mentions, these are the most watched videos about Uranium One in that time period. The red there are just Hannity YouTube videos of his show on Fox. So you see it's Fox, it's just driving this online and offline. The result is people don't trust the media, right? At least the right does not trust the mainstream media, because they're being told, not only did Seth Rich do this murder, not only is Uranium One this horrible controversy, but the New York Times isn't even talking about it, so they're corrupt as well. And this is not new. So this is back basically into the 1990s. Rush Limbaugh has been talking about his 4 corners of deceit, which is government, media, science, and academia. So it's a sort of a long-standing and explicit attack on getting truth from anywhere else other than that sort of insulated right media ecosystem. This is just showing going back, as far as 1993, there was the same issues. So how does this happen? How do we end up with this separate right system? Is this something that just happened in the last, election? We actually argue that it's been churning for a long time. We sort of make an argument in the book about sort of the history of radio broadcasts and cable. The very short of the argument is that in the late 80s, early 90s, the regulations for AM broadcasts were changed so that you could more easily have national AM shows that could actually make money. Rush Limbaugh figured out how to put on a political show that could take advantage of that national network, importantly to make money. He's made a lot of money doing this, so it's a successful commercial enterprise. And then we had a very similar thing happen with cable TV. Cable started off with not 3 channels, but just a handful of more channels, but then it was expanded in the sort of early 90s to be able to include a lot more channels, which gave room for channels like Fox that had a more niche audience. And then Fox did a very similar thing to what Rush did, which is to figure out how to successfully capture that niche and also make money doing it. It's a harder question about why there's been no liberal equivalent. So throughout our argument is the strong belief that there's no inherent cognitive difference between conservatives and liberals. It's not that conservatives like having this propaganda loop and just being told stuff they like, and liberals want the truth. There's no research showing that's the case, and there's lots of research arguably showing that it is not the case. And in fact, one of our strongest arguments is that conservatives are being very ill-served by this system. So how did this happen to conservatives and didn't happen to liberals? It's a hard question. We're not really sure the answer. One of the one of the potential answers has to do with sort of the nature of journalism as born. Journalism and these other institutions of truth, like government and academia, were sort of born of the progressive movement. They were all sort of created from whole cloth in the early 1900s in a mode that we could create a world where sort of neutral bureaucrats can sort of know the truth and tell us in this very complicated, complex world. And there was always a conservative pushback against that. But there's also been liberal pushback. So there are a lot of claims that of the core claim of the conservatives is that the mainstream media are just very liberally biased. So what do we know about that? We know that that most journalists are liberal. So there's good research that shows that most journalists are liberal. Partly it's just because the big papers, the big institutions are like the New York Times and Washington Post and even CNN are in big cities where you tend to have liberal people. And the kinds of people who are journalists these days tend to be sort of college educated, sort of elite types that tend to be liberal. But also, for whatever reason, we know that they're liberal journalists tend to be more liberal. We also know, though, that all of these big press organizations are owned by rich people, generally like privately owned by very rich people. And there's a whole equivalent of the conservative critique of liberal journalists on the liberal side, the sort of Noam Chomsky critique that mainstream media is just sort of journalism to uphold capitalism. But for whatever reason, that critique has not ever taken hold with quite the fervor that it has in the left as it has on the right. So this is more evidence that this is a long-standing problem. It's not just a problem that was created by Russia or fancier Facebook algorithms in the last 4 years. This is a map. We happen to have data to be able to make the same kind of map just based on the last month of the 2012 election. And what you see here is something that's pretty similar. You see more prominent center-right. So in the Weekly Standard and the National Review almost completely disappear in 2016. But you see Fox, you see Washington Examiner, Daily Caller, Breitbart, you see all the same players, and you see again the same clear distinction where they're off to the side and Huffington Post is cozied up with the big mainstream media. So this is more evidence that this is not something that just happened due to some dramatic technological cause in the 4 years. This is something that's been building. What is the effect of this right versus rest model on what the country ended up hearing about the candidates? This is a really great work by Gallup that just weekly called people and asked them, what do you know about Hillary Clinton? Just free form. And then what do you know about Donald Trump? It was that simple. That wasn't an exact question, but it was that. What have you heard about Donald Trump? What have you heard about Hillary Clinton? You see on the right, they've only heard about emails. This is pretty shocking, right, for a presidential candidate. And on the left, you see a bunch of stuff that's basically covering campaigning, and most importantly, in covering immigration and his most important issues. So how does that pop out of this weird asymmetrically polarized map? This is another example where we looked in our data for Trump scandal and issue coverage versus Clinton scandal and issue coverage. If you look in the upper right, you see that virtually all of the Clinton coverage is of her scandals, which means like emails and Clinton Foundation for the most part. Whereas most of Trump's coverage is of issues. What does issues mean? Issues for Trump might mean Trump says Mexicans are rapists. Right? So the New York Times is going to publish that as mostly a negative thing. But it's issue related. It's getting out some message to both sides of the aisle, right? Whereas a Trump scandal would be something like Trump scandal with women or a scandal with Trump University. Even though both candidates get virtually all negative coverage, which is true of virtually all candidates in virtually all races, the negative coverage that Trump is getting is teaching something about his values and beliefs and policies to the public sphere, whereas the negative coverage that Clinton is getting is teaching only the scandal information. So let's think a little bit about what that immigration coverage means. I've talked a lot about Fox today. But it's important to understand that Fox operates not just by itself generating news, it operates within this network. So it operates both within a network of its consumers and the media, but also in a network of other publishers. And this is what we actually mean when we talk about this network propaganda, is that little memes and facts just circulate around this insulated ecosystem with no breaks and just get sort of reconstituted and amplified all the time. So immigration is an example where Breitbart is actually driving the debate. So Fox is clearly, from all of our data, not driving the sort of dominance of immigration and discussion of this election. You see here, this is just proportion of sentences about immigration, and Breitbart of the major media is by far the highest. This is just coverage of immigration across the 6 top media outlets, and the red is Breitbart. And you can see Breitbart is just by far dominating. They're wanting to just talk only about immigration, and they're succeeding in driving that as the agenda. So this is a map similar to this larger election map, where we're just looking at stories about immigration. Here you see Breitbart is even more central. You see a pretty similar map as far as integrated left and center left. This is a little bit complicated. In addition to drawing these maps, we can use fancy math to say, hey, go look at this map and see which nodes are in sort of groups that seem to be related to each other. So in this bottom left, you see a bunch of conservative nodes that are all linking to each other when talking about immigration. And then you see a sort of panoply of different, you see what looks like light blue, which is kind of mainstream media, and then green, which are sort of like Pew Research, which are more like policy and data-oriented immigration sites. But you can run these algorithms with different levels of modularity. So you can say, how hard do you want to try to sort of separate? So how many of those communities do you want to get? No matter how we sort of use that dial, the red sites, the conservative sites, always end up together. So if we sort of drag that dial, we get more different communities on the left, or less communities on the left, but the right is always separate. So this is just more, again, data that we have that the right's just having a totally different conversation in general, but also specifically in immigration and specifically driven by Breitbart. So what does that Breitbart coverage look like? Our null hypothesis, which is to say our sort of first belief without really looking a lot at the data, is that there was going to be some mix of sort of racial immigration coverage and economic coverage. So typical, like the immigrants are coming to lower our wages and take our jobs. What we see when we look at this list of the most influential, these are not just random headlines that we chose because we thought they looked salacious. These are the most influential by hyperlinks, I think, stories on Breitbart. This is all stories about, to scare people about the racial elements of immigration. There's no way, I mean, and some of it's quite sort of, quite salacious. So Mexico helping unvetted African immigrants to the US border, many from al-Shabaab terror hotbed. So they're like Islamic terrorists coming from Mexico. 6 diseases returned to US as migration advocates celebrate World Refuge Day. So this is not immigrants coming to take our jobs. This is immigrants coming to, kill our 15-year-old children and to give us diseases. We get asked a lot about the Russians. It's exciting, and it's important. It's also someone who's very easy to blame. If it's the Russians that are doing it, then great, we can deal with the Russians. So what do we find when we look at the influence of the Russians? What we find when we look for them is we find them, right? So you can look at, there are various lists or ways of detecting which Twitter handles, for instance, are Russian sock puppets or bots or whatever. We find them there, and we find generally they're leaning pretty hard on the Trump side. So they're leaning into some of these sort of crazier stories to try to build influence. But we look really hard, and generally what we find is they're just participating, right? So a story will happen, something like Pizzagate will happen, and it'll take off, and then someone in this Russian team will say, yeah, let's encourage that. But they're encouraging a story that's born of this asymmetrically polarized ecosystem, and that is already distributing around it. So what we find at best is they're just sort of amplifying what's going on. It's hard to make it a definitive negative statement, but we looked really hard for a long time, and we couldn't find any cases where they're creating something and it's circulating through this network propaganda system and then actually popping out as some really influential story. We do find cases of them trying to start stuff, and it's often not working super well. So what does that look like in practice? So one theory of Russian influence is that a lot of the email coverage was driven by Russia because Russia did these email hacks, and the email hacks ended up resulting in these crazy stories like Pizzagate, and those just sort of associated, whether or not Pizzagate's true, if it just brings more attention to the word email, then it's a win. So the more the press is talking about Clinton and emails in a bad context, the more that's a win for Trump. So what we did is we collected all of those emails that were in any of the dumps, any of the WikiLeaks dumps. We looked for them in any of our 2.5 million stories. We looked at links to those emails. We do kind of a similar map where we sort of looked at which sources were linking to which specific emails. One big influential email was this email with the title Forward Dinner, which is this sort of this email about spirit cooking. It's this sort of performance artist that John Podesta had dinner with, and it's associated in bizarre conspiratorial ways with the Pizzagate scandal. So this is an example of Russia having some influence because Russia hacked those emails. So the story wouldn't have happened as it had happened without Russia intervening. And then you do have some uptake of this stuff. So you've got the story on InfoWars. InfoWars, I should say, is one of the major winners from this separated right ecosystem. We all kind of laugh at InfoWars. We're not sure what to think about it, whether to take it seriously. InfoWars, in our metrics, is somewhere between the 6th and 8th most influential site in that right ecosystem. So it's not a sort of fringe site that's not having an influence. It's right in the middle of that ecosystem. We can also, but then when we go and look, where did that story originate? We went and mined Reddit and 4chan and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram for mentions of the specific email. We find that it just comes from a very standard, Reddit troll, and then it gets amplified by these 4chan boards, which exist as sort of amplified troll stories. So there was some Russia, but there's also some sort of alt-right trolls. There's some InfoWars crazy conspiracy stuff. They're all kind of acting together. Russia has a role. Is it determinative? I'm not sure. But more importantly, when we look at email coverage over time, we have to keep in mind that that chart that I showed you that said email for Clinton, that data was as late as September. So September on this chart is right before these sort of big bumps happen. And you see steady coverage of emails all along the election. Virtually all of these are sort of typical elite-driven actions in the media. So it's a very typical model where the State Department comes out with a report, or an investigative journalist at a major publication comes out with some story, or a law enforcement agency comes out with some decision or announcement. These are all things that would have happened 40 years ago to drive the news. That's what's driving this email coverage until right at the end you see the Podesta email dump, which gets a lot of attention in October. But all of the data we says by October, it's very clear that the Clinton email framing is there. So whatever's happening after in October is just a cherry on the top. So this is another example again of, yes, Russia's having some influence, but it's really just jumping on a dysfunction that's already there. All right, so another example of, so let's talk about the mainstream media role. So the hope in all this, we'll talk about solutions at the end. There's hope that mainstream media is still the center of gravity, right? So one of the pieces of hope we take from our work is mainstream media is still having major influence. We're not simple cheerleaders of that mainstream media. We recognize and discuss seriously that there are serious problems with the sort of model of objective journalism. It's not a sort of easy win-all mode. As I've discussed, it has a lot of benefits over this sort of propaganda model mode. So one of the things we're learning is, yes, there are reasons to doubt this, but hey, there are reasons to be done that way. But But then there's some downsides too. And one of the downsides is that those mainstream media are susceptible to sort of attention hacking, which we'll discuss in this in the mode of this Uranium-1 story. So this is the linked network of stories that are discussing this Uranium-1 conspiracy. And just to note, initially, you see a lot of red. You see Fox and Breitbart paying a lot of attention to this story. But then most importantly, you see the New York Times is the most influential story, talking about Uranium-1, which the New York Times, at least now, acknowledges as bunk. So how does that happen? That happens because there's a sort of false sense of balance. So there's a set of norms for how we do objective journalism. One norm is you write in an inverted pyramid style. So we all sort of take it for granted, but when you read a news story, it doesn't read like a narrative story. You read the most important thing first, and then the next most important thing, so they're all written like that. Another norm of objective journalism is it's based on facts, right? So it's not just the beliefs of the journalist. He goes out and tries to find some sort of official source of facts and presents those. Another is a balance, right? So in the 1800s, all newspapers basically were just partisan. It was, you read newspaper from one side or the other. So we have now, after this progressive movement, you have an idea of a neutral newspaper that presents both sides. What the right media ecosystem is doing is taking advantage of that notion of balance. So all of this negative stuff that's being talked about Trump, they have to find an equal amount of negative stuff to talk about Clinton. So they're going to latch onto whatever they can. And the right media ecosystem realizes that, so they just present stuff that's available for the mainstream media to latch onto. The very obvious example is this Uranium-1 story. The Uranium-1 story came from a book called Clinton Cash. Clinton Cash was actually written by an author who was funded by Steve Bannon and by Robert Mercer, who was Steve Bannon's major funder. It was created it was just a book written with opposition research about Hillary Clinton, specifically for the election. But they presented it to the New York Times as, here's some bad stuff that you can write about Clinton. And the New York Times needs to write bad stuff about Clinton. So the New York Times actually agreed to do an exclusive report on this Uranium-1 story. In the 9th paragraph of the story, they acknowledge that this is based on opposition research. And the 10th paragraph, which again, remember the inverted pyramid style, where you're supposed to write the most important stuff first because we recognize that a lot of readers won't even get to the end. They say that there was no wrongdoing. It just kind of looks bad, right? The result is when we look at these are sort of maps of just single month sorts of discussion of the story. You see that, especially early on, that New York Times story provides legitimacy to the discussion of this topic. So all the other sites are just linking. They've succeeded in getting the New York Times to write about this, and now they're gaining legitimacy from the trust in the New York Times. So where does that leave us? That leaves us back at SAS talking about the deepfake the perfect storm of deepfakes. This drives me crazy, right? So we've had Photoshop available for a long time. I'm not giving an hour-long lecture about how Photoshop has destroyed truth in our country, right? So these deepfakes are basically the idea. It's basically Photoshop for videos. But it's really easy for Ben Sasse, who likes to be seen as a very serious and in some ways bipartisan politician, to be able to blame someone for who we're in this problem. So technology is easy to blame, right? The winning quote is here at this bottom, where he says, put more bluntly, Vladimir Putin loves cable news and the divides it helps to solidify in the American soul. He's identifying the actual problem there, right? So the problem is this sort of polarized cable news system, driven mostly by Fox, where we have this propaganda feedback loop on one side and the reality check model on the other side. The problem is not, do you have a video? Do you have something that can create fake videos? That's it.
So we're happy to take questions now.
Yeah, so far you've been blaming the media, but you've neglected the role of demographics and how neighborhoods are shifting, they're becoming more uniform, more polarized, more people moving to urban environments, they're leaving people behind in the rural areas. And to what extent do you think those deeper demographic trends are driving a lot of this?
That's a good question for sure. I think that the demographics are embedded in the politics and the institutions, right? So our main point that we're hoping to get across is that there are deep political and institutional reasons for this. So there are a lot of people who want to read Fox News, right? So I'm not trying to say that it's just sort of evil Fox News up there, or evil Fox News and Alex Jones, or whatever set of people who are sort of deceiving a bunch of people, otherwise people who would be happy to get the truth. What I'm saying is we have this sort of system, this deeply ingrained system where we have the media, we have the politicians, and we have the public, and they're all working off each other. So we're media scholars, so we think mostly about that media piece. Dr. Jasperson could write more expertly about the political piece there, where they're participating as well. And what you're identifying is this sort of public piece, and they're for sure all operating off one another. What I would say is, I would take again as an assumption that one of the reasons we are segregating demographically and geographically is because of our media consumption, right? So they feed into each other for sure.
It's already on. How did you determine, just as a point of clarity, how did you determine the ideological identity of each individual news source?
So what we did is we collected about 4.5 million tweets that were about the election. We parsed all of the URLs out of those tweets. That ended up being about 1 million separate stories. So a lot of the URLs, you can have 5 different URLs that actually point to the same thing. So we canonicalize all those URLs. So we end up with about 1 million stories that people tweeted during the election, and we know who tweeted them. And then what we look at is we had a set of about 30,000 users who at some point retweeted Hillary Clinton during the election, and we had about 60,000 users who at some point retweeted Donald Trump. There was a shockingly small overlap between those groups. There were something like 200 users who retweeted both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We did not, I would have expected that to be 10,000 users. It was very small. And those colors that you saw are just the ratios of how many times stories from a given media source were shared by a Hillary Clinton retweeter versus a Donald Trump retweeter after they've been normalized, so because we had more Donald Trump retweeters. So what we're measuring, it's just a purely quantitative metric that we're just measuring basically how much, if we take Hillary Clinton retweeters as liberal, if we assume that's representative of liberal tweeters, and we assume that Donald Trump retweeters are representative of conservative tweeters, then we have a ratio of how many times each site was shared by liberal versus conservative tweeters. So there's when you think back about that histogram, where almost all the attention was paid to the far right, that means almost all the attention was paid to sites on the right that are only ever tweeted by conservative tweeters. Whereas on the left, you have attention paid to a range of sites that are tweeted, in some cases only by liberal tweeters, but in a lot of cases by some larger portion of conservative tweeters as well. It's a good question. One of our open research questions that we're addressing now is how to identify partisanship by content. This tweeter trick only really works during an election because you have these very obvious groups, whereas if you try to do it now, it just doesn't work because there's no equivalent examples of Trump is easy, but there's no example on the other side. So you can look at content. There are good examples of doing that. We're doing that now. You can look at more complex Twitter measures. What we specifically don't do is just look at the site and say, that looks liberal, or try to code it that way. That's not, we take seriously not just using objective data for things like that.
So we've been talking a lot about the nature of truth this afternoon, and I was wondering if you think that that media can be truthful as a whole, and if it can, what sources would you recommend that we look at as just lay people in America?
So excellent question. So truth is really hard. We would love to be able to draw one of those maps with nodes highlighted by the amount of truth they have. We can't do that. We've actually tried it. So you can do this as a methodological issue. We do a lot of the stuff we do with just numbers, but you can do a lot with coding too. And you can do it in a robust way. So if you can get 5 people in a room, give them instructions for how to code this as true versus not true, and then you get them to do it independently. If they all agree, then that's a good sign that anybody else could do that, so it's repeatable, and so we could say, yeah, that's a good way of figure out what's true and what's not true. We can't make that work. Nobody can make it work because it's really hard. A lot of the so there's a lot of attention paid to fake news, and the term fake news came from a great story by Craig Silverman, who writes for BuzzFeed, and he went and looked at the sources. He had a list of sites that were sort of new sites that seemed kind of sketchy about politics, and then sort of old sites, and he called those new sketchy sites fake news sites. And for the top stories, those fake news sites were getting as many Facebook shares as the top stories on mainstream media. Mainstream media publishes a lot more stories, and there's a lot more of those sources. So overall, there's a lot more attention paid to the mainstream media. So that finding was a little bit confusing. But still, it's alarming that some of the most popular overall, most shared stories during the election were stuff from these fake news sites that seemed like they were just made up out of whole cloth. Some of these sites were actually just Estonian teenagers sitting in their bedrooms making up stuff to make money from Facebook ads, literally that. But when you look at most of those stories, most of the stories were just new sites that were resharing memes that were just floating around the right-wing media ecosystem. Just sort of resharing stuff from Zero Hedge and InfoWars and these kind of sites. And a lot of if you look at a site like Breitbart claims there is no such thing as objective journalism. They happily say that. If you interview them, they'll say, yeah, everybody should just argue for what they believe. The New York Times is hurting you more by pretending to tell the truth. They should just argue for what they believe. But while doing that, Breitbart actually obeys many of the forms of objective journalism. So Breitbart stories are all written in this inverted pyramid style, which most of us don't realize that we're reading when we read it. But nonetheless, when we read something in that style, we're primed to think, oh, I'm reading something that's like a newspaper, versus if I read like an op-ed, it's in a very narrative essay style and it reads very differently. So my mind sort of says, oh, this looks official, this looks the truth. Breitbart is famous for referring to official reports and facts. So if you read it, it's very like, here's the most important stuff, and this is based on a report from the German government, or this is based by this report or this expert. So even though they say they're not doing objective journalism, they're actually kind of making it look like objective journalism. So that makes it really hard. What we find in our research, again, is that we find the big old institutions of journalism seem to be trying, and the other side seems to not be. So another sort of natural experiment we found in our data is that, do you guys remember that Trump gave out these fake news awards? Remember that was like 10 minutes, 27 years ago? So he had 5 examples of like the worst examples of mainstream media making up bad stories about him. So we go back and look at all those fake news stories. In 4 of those 5 cases, the journalists responsible for the stories were either fired or severely, professionally reprimanded for the story. And virtually all the stories were corrected very quickly. So what we find, this is an example of what you read in the New York Times is not always going to be true. It's certainly not always going to be balanced or from the right point of view. But they have some set of norms and processes that they're trying really hard to follow. When we have examples on the other side, like the Seth Rich story, where Fox just had to, when it became clear that there was just a circular set of sources who were citing each other, that they had just been told to cite each other, they just said, oh yeah, that's not true. There was no actual consequence to anybody at Fox News for having done that, which is an indication that they're not really trying in any sense to get to the truth.
Any other questions? I guess I have one last question for you, just thinking about where things might be going in the future. So you mentioned that mainstream media still seems to be at the center of some of these patterns or networks, and that is in some ways comforting, in other ways not. But how might you see this evolving as our population changes and people who use kind of incumbent or legacy media like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, that used to be print sources, and we see a shift to more, interactive media, social media, and other forms of media. Could you see this changing? What is your sense of how things might be evolving, if your data gives you any sense of that?
So I have to just conjecture. So I don't, we would need a long time series to look at the question directly. But the sense from looking at the data is, if anything, we see increased influence of the core mainstream media, just looking from like 2012 through 2018. Trump is really good for the New York Times business, right? And for the Washington Post. We spent a lot of time, so we had a lot of our results, and then toward the end of the election, and then right after the election, there was a lot of attention paid to fake news. And we frankly didn't have a lot of the biggest fake news stories in our sort of open web link-based collection system. So this was kind of a check for us, like, oh, shoot. We've been collecting all this data thinking we've been seeing what happens, but we don't even have some of these fake news stories. We didn't even know that they existed, even though they had millions of shares. So we went back and looked quite hard to see, how do we miss those, and was there proportionally a much greater news for this sort of made up out of whole cloth fake news, or what we've lately been calling Facebook bullshit. Was there a greater role for this than we had seen in our data when we'd done our initial work? And the short answer is, number one, most of these sites, they don't even appear in the link architecture. So they're getting a lot of attention via shares on Facebook, but they're not being really included in this larger kind of architecture of information. They're just not really there. They're kind of effervescent. And that makes us think, I don't know, it's hard to know what, someone's reading it, someone's sharing it, that's an eyeball, and that's a vote for attention, but the fact that it doesn't really get linked or included in this other ecosystem, or for the most part even in Twitter, is a sign that maybe it's not having so much influence. And when we compare when we look at the total number of Facebook shares over time for these both mainstream media and just more traditional, web-based media, and then we try to look at those fake news, the fake Facebook bullshit sites, stories in the context of all those other stories, we find them just to be a blip. So we looked at the top 100 stories by Facebook shares about the election, and I'm forgetting now, but I think 2 of them were these sort of, made up out of whole cloth Facebook kind of shared stories. So that's not nothing. Those 2 of the most 100 influential election stories, that's not great. But it's certainly not that everybody's getting their news from this fake social media. So all of that put together says that we don't see any evidence that the big major mainstream media sites and journalistic institutions are losing influence. If you remember, I showed our, go all the way back to the beginning here. If you look at our Twitter and Facebook maps, you see that some of the hyperpartisan sites get bigger as you go to the Facebook, the social media based sites, but so do the mainstream media. So these sort of second order partisan sites tend to sort of lose some influence, but the core of that mainstream media. So all the data we have so far, I have no idea what's going to happen 10, 20 years from now, says that social media is playing a role, but it's not at all determinative. And if anything, it's funneling some more attention to the hyperpartisan sides, but also it's just funneling a lot more attention to the core of that mainstream.
Seeing no other questions, we will give Hal a round of applause, and then please come join us in the back for book signing.